I hope you've been having a good week. I know everybody enjoyed your long weekend last weekend. I expect the thank you notes will be coming in the mail. Thank you for those in advance. But it's so great to have Cohort B with us here this week after being so excited about having Cohort A with us last week. There's going to be a little bit of a contest, I think, about which cohort we like the best. So I hope that you'll do your best in order to earn our favor in that regard. Today, if you have questions, and I hope many of you will, you're to use the Q&A feature. What is a virus? How do viruses behave? Why is this one, which has disrupted life on a global scale, so pernicious? How exactly is this microscopic infectious agent causing a pandemic the likes of which the world hasn't seen in 100 years? And how do we stop it? To answer some of these questions for us, we welcome our first Hall Speaker of the Year, Dr. Nahid Bhadelia. Dr. Bhadelia is an infectious disease physician and the director of the Special Pathogens Unit at Boston University School of Medicine. She oversees the medical response program for BU's Maximum Containment Biosafety Level 4 program at the National Emerging Infectious Diseases Laboratories. Dr. Bhadelia serves on national and interagency groups focused on medical countermeasures, the intersection between public health preparedness, research, and clinical care for emerging pathogens. Her research focuses on identification of safe and effective clinical interventions and infection control measures. During the West African Ebola epidemic, Dr. Bhadelia served as a clinician in several Ebola treatment units, working with the World Health Organization and Partners in Health. She currently serves as the clinical lead for a joint US-Ugandan effort to combat viral hemorrhagic fevers in Uganda at the border of the Democratic Republic of Congo. She has served as a subject matter expert to the CDC, the Department of Defense, the Global Fund to Fight AIDS, Tuberculosis, and Malaria, and the World Bank. Dr. Bhadelia earned her undergraduate and medical degrees at Tufts, where she also earned a master's degree in international affairs from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. Dr. Bhadelia is an associate professor at the Institute of Human Security at the Fletcher School, where she teaches a course on human security and emerging infectious diseases. She's a regular medical contributor on MSNBC and was featured this spring on the PBS NOVA program, Decoding COVID-19. Please help me in welcoming to Roxbury Latin this morning, Dr. Nahid Bhadelia.
Thank you so much, Mr. Brennan, and thank you to all the students for having me on today, given how different I'm guessing this semester has been for you compared to prior ones. And so I'm hoping that while we talk about all the factual things, part of what we talk about is how we move through this time. Your class, and then classes starting right now, you know, either in schools or in colleges, these are historic classes. You're going through something that humanity hasn't gone through in over 100 years. And so we'll talk about the science of it, but one of the things that I hope that you'll do as you go through this year, this experiences, is that you document it, you write about it, you take photographs, so that when we all look back at it, this is an experience that we can sort of learn from and reflect on. So today, I'm gonna see if I can have technology on my side and share this PowerPoint here. Let's see. I'm guessing that's visible now. So what I want to talk a little bit about is COVID-19 and the current pandemic, but also talk about viruses in general and why we're seeing an increased number of epidemics and pandemics, you know, or rather epidemics, which this one turned out to become a pandemic from. So before I start, I wanted to the very kind introduction from Mr. Brennan about what I do. I wanted to sort of expand what that means. So I'm a doctor that deals with infectious diseases, and I specifically deal with infectious diseases that are new, that we don't know that much about, that we don't yet have treatments for, we don't have vaccines for, and sometimes we don't even have the best diagnostic tests for. So I work for a laboratory and a university, the Boston University School of Medicine, and a laboratory called the National Infectious Diseases Labs, here you see on the right at the bottom, that deals with a lot of dangerous viruses and studying, you know, how they can cause infections and coming up with solutions and identifying treatments for those. What I do is I run a a 3-bed unit. It's a medical unit at a hospital that provides backup to the lab. So in case, in that very unlikely setting, if there's an exposure to one of these pathogens, that we have the space to take care of these patients safely. So the slide, the photo you see on the top there is one of the drills that we did with researchers at the laboratory. And that's sort of what drew me into West Africa. Mr. Brennan talked about the fact that I'd been in West Africa during the Ebola outbreak, and then most recently actually was in Uganda. There's another Ebola outbreak in Democratic Republic of Congo in 2008, so I was back sort of helping with that. And what you see here are some of the images from West Africa. So if you're ever looking for me in a crowd, I'm generally the shortest one. So in the photo on the left, I am the shortest person there. And then just to say that, you know, in each of my works in different places, the bottom left image here is Uganda, the work that I'm doing currently. The one on the right is Sierra Leone, and the one on the top is Boston. In all of those settings, this is the type of work that's done by hardworking teams who are giving, you know, part of their time to try to combat these new diseases and putting all this effort into keeping our communities safe. So because yes.
I'm so sorry. I'm just getting word that our participants are having a hard time seeing your screen. So I'm going to see if that's something that I can figure out on my end here.
Okay. Are the images not coming through, or?
I think they're just having a hard time seeing your screen at all. Your sort of your screen share slides here. Let's see. I'm also hearing from one of the students who left the meeting and rejoined that the issue was fixed.
Okay.
So what I'm going to ask, and I know this is
I stop and reshare?
If you want to reshare, but also if participants leave, come back on, they should be able to see everything. So anybody that can't, if you would leave, come back onto the webinar. We'll hold on a minute. We'll just start in a minute and pick up where we left. I'm sorry about this.
No worries at all. I'm looking at the Q&A. I joined late. It's fine for me too. No problem for me.
So I think we're good. Just if we could just wait about 30 seconds, let anybody back off, and we should be good to go. So I'll let you know. Okay, I think we can keep going here.
Great.
Yeah.
So just sharing about the teams that I work with in Uganda and Sierra Leone, and then here in Boston on the top. So today I because we're talking about pretty complex scientific issues, I want to make sure that we all understand some of the common themes that are the common words that I'll be using over and over again in this presentation. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the viruses and the epidemics, as I mentioned, and then what in particular is COVID-19. And how do we take care of COVID-19 patients? And then in a public health level, how do we control this pandemic? So what is a virus? And actually, Mr. Brennan said it pretty well. These are small infectious particles. They're tiny particles that exist out in the world. There are millions of these, different types of these, in fact. And they are particles that basically invade other living things. That's what allows them to continue to replicate. And the way they infect people and who they infect completely depends on the type of the virus that we're talking about. Give me 1 second. Okay. So the way that it depends on the virus. So the coronavirus, which is what we're currently talking about, is a type of this virus, and the name that it gets, we'll talk a little bit about it. It's a virus that is spread through between humans, and sometimes if it's that brand new type of coronavirus, from animals into humans. And so we'll talk a little bit about COVID-19, but the viruses themselves are interesting. So what they need is they need the machinery of the human body or whatever living thing that they're infecting, because there might be viruses that are dog viruses, and there might be viruses that are cat viruses, and generally viruses tend to stay with the host. They have a favored host that they like. But some viruses aren't that specific. You know, they'll infect many different types of hosts, and they'll cause different types of disease in different hosts. But in essence, what they do is they get into your body, and your cells, you guys might have heard of what cells are. They're the smallest sort of component of what your body is made out of. So your skin, for example, has millions of cells. Your organs have millions of cells. And so in the human body, we have about 30 trillion cells. The virus basically gets into any of your cells. It has a particular predilection of the type of cells that it likes. Depends on the viruses we're talking about. A different virus might like a different type of cell. It uses probably what it uses is that there are markers around each of your cells, and so it uses a particular marker that your cell has, and it sticks on it. And with the help of that marker, it inserts itself into your cells, and then replicates using the machinery inside your own cell, and then bursts out when it's created multiple copies of itself. So the way that your body protects yourself against that is as you might have already learned about, we have an entire powerful aspect of our body called the immune system. It's many different types of cells that are built in different organs. And the immune system, basically what it does is it recognizes these threats. The minute something enters your body that's not supposed to be there, it recognizes it. It protects you by doing many different actions, by alerting the rest of the body that this infection has happened, by creating cells that specifically block infection. And once it fights off an infection successfully, it builds memory for the future. So if you were ever to find that infection again, whether it's a virus or a bacteria, it will try to beat that off much faster the next time around. So you may not even get sick, even if you're sort of exposed to it again. The viruses are tricky. The way that they're tricky is that they tend to trick your immune system sometimes. They know that this attack is coming, right? This onslaught from your immune system is coming. And so they'll do a few things. They will try to escape the notice of the immune system sometimes. They will try to co-opt some immune cells. And I know Dr. Alter, who's speaking next week, may go into some of this, so I won't go into too much detail, but just to tell you that viruses in particular are interesting, because if your body figures out, for example, a way to recognize it and kill it, some viruses, like the flu virus, that we talk about, are super tricky in the fact that they can mutate. They change the parts of their body that your body started to recognize, the parts of their structure that the body started to recognize, that tend to mutate. And so that your body can't perfectly identify it. All those antibodies, those proteins that your body created to protect you from an infection, the virus changes itself so that when the next time it attacks you, your body's still going, wait, that looks familiar, but it's not quite right. And so your immune response is not as powerful as it could be. Maybe it protects you a little bit, but not a lot. The way that vaccines protect you is basically they give your immune system, a little bit of a sample of the structure of the virus. What we're doing when we vaccinate people, it doesn't matter what vaccine we're using, the principle is the same. We are trying to give your body a lesson without actually going through the infection. So you can either get immunity by getting the infection a lot of times, or you can get it through getting a vaccine that basically introduces you to a part of the virus, just a structure that's not replicating. And that is then used by your body to create the same type of response, the cells, the antibodies, to basically the next time you see that infection, you can sort of fight it off, but you don't have to have gone through all that experience, unfortunate or unpleasant experience of having the infection itself. So that's sort of the gist of what viruses are. And I wanted to make sure we got into a gist of that before I talked about why we're seeing so many viral infections and so many different epidemics. So my job, when I was a kid, it was my dream to become a cross between. You probably haven't seen this movie. It was a movie called Outbreak with Dustin Hoffman. Which basically, it's a scientist that goes out and helps sort of combat these emerging infectious diseases. And I've been lucky enough to do this. The unfortunate thing is, most people in my field didn't recognize how much in demand we would increasingly be. And so the numbers speak for themselves. These are numbers from a report from the World Economic Forum that basically say that between 1980 and 2013, we had about 12,000 recorded outbreaks around the world. And that's about 44 million individual cases affecting every single different country in the world, different types of diseases, viruses, bacteria, fungi. And then every month, even now, the World Health Organization, which is sort of the body that looks over and provides support to all the countries in the world, tracks about 70,000 new signals, which means, a country can call them up and say, hey, looks like we might have an outbreak. Can you give us help? And they get 7,000 rather of these calls every single month. And then they follow up about 300 times in person and do about 30 investigations. So there's constantly a risk of outbreaks in our new world. And part of the reason why we're seeing this increasing risk of new infections is a couple of reasons. So one is the fact that more of them are actually arising, and it is true that we're looking for them, right? We have technology that's better. We have diagnostic tests that are better. So some of this might be that, maybe some of these diseases were always there. We've just gotten better at looking and testing for them. And so we're detecting them, but that's still a small amount. Majority of the reason why we're seeing more of these diseases is because more of them are arising. And the reason they're arising is multifold. One is population increase. When I was born in 1970 something, the world's population was about half of what it is right now, right? So twice as many people, same amount of space. And not only that, but what we're seeing is we're using a lot more of the land. We're using lots of different cars and industries that are creating potentially a change in our environment, which are causing a change in our climate. And that in itself has an impact on infectious disease. And I'm going to talk about how that happens. The other thing we're doing is we are using up a lot more of the land for animals, because as we grow as a population, we need food. So we're creating farms, we're creating, animal husbandry sort of areas where we're growing more chickens and cows and, other domestic animals. And domestic animals are then existing next to an area where wild animals used to exist, before we cleared out the space to put the domestic animals there. And that's giving a chance, because if you remember what I said, viruses are particular, they like certain animals and that's what they're used to. But if you give them the opportunity to be introduced to other animals, they might try to make a jump. So we'll talk about that in a second. The other reason we're seeing a big increase is there's a huge ability to spread now. The virus, if it happens somewhere, because we're so connected. So 2017, 4 billion people took a flight in the world. That's the sort of the immense scope of the amount of travel that we have. In 2002, when there was this huge epidemic you might have heard of, which is SARS, the first SARS, which is a different kind of coronavirus. There was an epidemic that, was in multiple countries. And in 2002, and that was about 18 years ago, what was said was that it was because of travel. You were able to see SARS travel from China, where it arose, to North America and Canada, and back in China in 72 hours. And that's sort of just the speed at which viruses can travel now. And so this is why we always say that an outbreak anywhere is an outbreak everywhere, because we're all connected. We also trade with each other. We get our food from other countries and back and forth. We travel for business. And so all of those things connect us very, very intimately with each other. So here's sort of the, from Alliance, which is a company that's sort of looking at insurance and, and sort of the impact on our world. This is the population predictions that we have, this trend of seeing more people. We're going to see that increase. So, we're currently at 2020 and we're over 7 billion. So we will easily hit, in 2024, we will easily hit 8 billion people. And then 2048, we're thought to be 9 billion people. So you can sort of see the increase in population. And because of that, as I mentioned, there's a few things that have changed. There's more of us because we've done a really good job at creating food and keeping people healthy and having people live longer. And so the longer they live, the more likely they are to potentially have children. And, and so the population continues to grow. So people are living longer. We've decreased, there's still considerable poverty in the world, You know, many places that I work with, you know, it's not just the fact that the disease is dangerous, is that, you know, communities do not have access to good healthcare, and they don't have access to good food and nutrition. And so the poverty still exists, but we've actually improved the level, decreased the level of poverty than what it used to be globally. And we've made it so that children around the world, there's less chances of them getting an infection and dying from, and that number, what we call child mortality, has gotten bigger. But then there's all these changes in our environment. So I mentioned carbon dioxide emissions, you know, so that's where we're seeing that from farming, we're seeing that from industries, from cars, from all the places where we use fossil fuel. We're sort of releasing carbon dioxide, which is changing the temperature of the earth. It is changing how acidic the ocean floor is. And then we're losing tons of forests for the reasons we talked about, and we're using more water, right? So why does all of that matter? So it matters because when you have for infectious diseases, when you have really a lot of overpopulation, what you could see is that if you have people living in closer quarters, what is an infectious disease? It is basically a disease that is communicable. You can pass it on between people, you know, and so it's not like heart disease where you have it and unfortunately, you know, you have to live with it, but you can't pass it on to somebody else. Infectious diseases tend to take advantage of crowded spaces. So the more of us there are, the more of us live in closer proximity, the easier it is for these infectious diseases to pass between people. And again, the way they pass between people completely depends on the type of virus. Sometimes the viruses require that you're in close proximity and people are touching you when you're sick. And other times, it's enough to be in a room with someone for an extended period of time for that virus to transmit itself. But then the other things that we're seeing is, you know, we talked about this idea that we're a bigger population, so we want more farms, you know, so we're clearing out the forests and we're creating more areas for domestic animals. Viruses are basically, because of the greater demand and deforestation, viruses are basically jumping from wildlife into domestic animals, or from wildlife into humans, and from domestic animals into humans. And we'll talk in a second on the next slide about that. And then there are other things that are happening where, you know, we need water and we need farming. And so we're getting rid of areas called wetlands where, you know, all these wild birds and fowls used to live. And they carry novel influenza. You know, I talked about how influenza is so tricky, it mutates, right? There's birds tend to have avian influenza. There's this kind of virus that's super tricky. It mutates very quickly. And so what's happening is this wild birds are hanging out with domestic birds, and the viruses are able to jump from wild birds into domestic birds, and then eventually from domestic birds into humans when we eat them, when we sell the birds that are potentially infected to other people. So the term that I use is something called emerging infectious disease. And emerging infectious disease is something that appears for the first time. You know, we didn't know about it. It's a brand new sort of virus, or there are re-emerging infectious diseases. All of sort of the dynamics that I talked about, what's happening is you're seeing rise of new viruses for the reasons I talked about, which is, you know, viruses are jumping from animals into humans, or there's re-emerging infectious diseases, which basically means that we controlled it, you know, and we had a solution for it, and now all of a sudden it's reappearing. And so there's the new ones are happening because of the reasons we talked about. The other thing that's happening is you are seeing viruses and other infections all of a sudden exist in areas of the world that they couldn't before. So why is that? Well, let's say you're a virus that loves a certain type of temperature, you know, and you can only exist in countries where that temperature exists. So if it's like humid and moist, and that's what you love as a virus, and that's how you transmit yourself, all of a sudden, if more of the world becomes hot and humid, you can see why it would be easier now for that virus to exist in another place, right? Same thing might happen for something like malaria. So malaria is a parasitic infection. It's not a virus, but it's a parasitic infection that's carried by mosquitoes. Mosquitoes love certain types of environments. So mosquitoes that parasite malaria is carried by, all of a sudden, if you create environments where, you know, mosquitoes can live a lot more easily, then they're more likely to transmit that disease. So we're seeing that now with parasitic infections. We're seeing that with viruses. And then there are infectious diseases that measles, for example, we have vaccines for, but then, you might have certain areas of the world where people become suspicious, and so they're not using, the vaccines that are available to them. And because of that, their memories for that disease go down. They don't have that, vaccination helps create that immune memory, right? So if you don't have that immune memory, you're going to get the disease. You're going to have to go through the disease. And so we're seeing those diseases sort of burst up again that we had controlled before. And then last bit is there's sometimes, bacteria, for example, that we use antibiotics for, but bacteria are smart too, not as smart as viruses. But of course, I'm prejudiced because I work on viruses. There are other infectious diseases that work, physicians that work on bacteria. But bacteria do the same thing where, you have an antibiotic, which is a medication that we use against bacterial infections only. And then they get smart and they change their structure so that the antibiotic doesn't do them any harm. So when you overuse an antibiotic, the bacteria gets sort of used to the structure itself and can escape being treated by an antibiotic. So what's actually happening, right? So I talked about the bottom screen of the stage 1, you see on the left, right? So 60% of all new emerging infectious diseases are called zoonoses. This is your word for the day. It's basically zoonoses are infections that jump from animals into humans. And so at the bottom, what you're seeing is, wild animals like bats and monkeys and great apes are interacting with domestic animals. And so the interesting thing about the viruses that we're seeing emerge now is they are something called, zoonotic viruses that are particularly good at mutating. They're good at mutating, and because they're good at mutating, they can adjust to a whole range of animals, not just the one that they love, but they'll try. They'll keep jumping, and then eventually what you might see, so you see that here, eventually what you might see in the second stage is that over time, they try jumping into domestic animal. It doesn't work, because it's not quite right. So they change a little bit and they jump again. And so you might then see something we call spillover, which is the virus finds the right type of structure. It's evolved enough, it's mutated enough so that all of a sudden it can attack a different kind of animal. So then it attacks a cow or a chicken. And then the person who is raising those chickens, gets exposed to that virus. And so eventually it tries to make the jump to the human. It does that. The human gets sick. The human spreads it to other people. And then the stage 3 of this is where you might go from potentially having local, groups of people who get sick to potentially having that outbreak go everywhere. So 91% of these new viruses that we're seeing are coming from wild animals. And that's thought to be what happened with SARS-CoV-2, the virus that causes COVID-19. So why do we have trouble finding these viruses, right? Why can't we just immediately find them the minute they jump from animals to humans, or minute they cause a few cases? If you could catch them, then you could keep them from becoming epidemics. Like, you could keep them from spreading everywhere. So why is that difficult? So the reason it is because if you want to detect an emerging infectious disease, you have to have people realize that they're actually sick. So these tricky viruses, some of them, they may cause symptoms. They make you sick, you have the infection, and sometimes you may have symptoms, and the symptoms may look like everything else, So you might know that the symptoms for COVID-19 are, fever and headache and trouble breathing. But fever and headache and nausea, vomiting, and other things that you're seeing with COVID-19 could also be influenza. It could be a lot of other sort of diseases. So early on, a person may get sick and they may not know that they have this virus, this emerging virus versus a common virus. And so they have to recognize that they're sick, or they have to have symptoms, and the tricky thing with COVID-19 has been that, a good percentage of people never develop symptoms. And so because they don't develop these symptoms, they can pass on the disease to others who might get sick from it, but they themselves don't get sick from it, so they don't realize they're sick, and so they don't seek help, and they don't, keep themselves inside their homes to protect others. then they have to have the ability to get to care. And so this is less of an issue here in the United States, but in many of the other communities that I work with around the world, patients don't have access to good healthcare. And so they're in their villages, and their villages are, hours away from healthcare. And so that ability to travel, the ability to economically afford healthcare is sort of limiting in a lot of communities in the world still. They don't have even access to primary care. Then you have to have clinicians, the doctors that they end up seeing. If you get to the clinic, the doctor needs to see it and say, okay, yeah, this looks like something different. It doesn't look like malaria. It doesn't look like flu. This could be something new. And so if you're not looking for it, or if you don't have the ability to test for it, right? Part of the challenge with emerging infectious diseases is that we need to build brand new tests. When we discover a new virus, we're then having to develop brand new tests that allow us to actually find that in bodies. And so that's what happened with SARS-CoV-2, the virus that causes COVID-19. Once we discovered it, we had to then create tests. And early on, they may not be perfect. They're not, we get better with time in figuring out tests that are good for detecting these viruses as well. And then you have to have a public health system that's, fast enough to respond. And in some countries, more than others, this is an issue because they may not have enough resources, or they may not, the governments that they have may not think it's an important enough sort of threat. And because early on, maybe they think that, well, it's not causing a lot of symptoms, it's not such a big deal until it becomes too big and it's out of control. And that's when you sort of need international partners to sort of come in and help out, particularly in countries that are resource limited. So what is COVID-19? Getting to the meat of this, right? So this is an infectious disease that's caused by a brand new virus. And I know Dr. Alter is going to probably talk about this a little bit when she comes next week, I think, or the week after. And so in December 2019, there's a brand new virus that was discovered in China called SARS-CoV-2. And it's a virus that we think is similar to other viruses discovered in bats. And it's unclear if it went from bats into humans or if there was an in-between step where it went into another animal, similar to what I talked about before, the way the viruses spill over into humans. And we don't know exactly when it spilled into humans, and it may have been as early as November 2020, but it started causing these symptoms in a group of people that didn't seem right. It didn't seem like other influenzas. It didn't seem like other common diseases. So the government of China became very suspicious and looked for all the people who might have these types of symptoms and isolated samples from them and looked for a brand new virus. And what they found was this virus. And the trouble with a brand new virus, remember how I said that if you get exposed to a virus, your body gets an immune response to it? A brand new virus, nobody in the world has an immune memory to because we've never encountered it. And that's why a brand new virus can cause a pandemic much more easily because none of us have the immune memory to block it. We're all experiencing it for the first time. And so that's why this has become such a big deal because it's a virus that's similar in a family of the viruses that's the same as common cold and other viruses in the past that have caused epidemics like SARS and MERS. You might have heard those terms. SARS was the virus that I've talked about that caused a big epidemic in 2002. It's a whole range of family with different types of risks, everything from a common cold to the very serious infections like SARS-CoV-2 and COVID-19 and SARS and MERS. And so it's a virus family that's, again, it's thankfully, it doesn't mutate as fast as the flu does, but it's still a virus and it's super tricky and it does a couple of things. So what SARS-CoV-2, the virus that causes COVID-19, what it has is it has these proteins on top of its surface. It looks like the picture that you see here. And the term corona comes from referring to the crown. You see the crown that the woman is wearing here on the statue is wearing on the left here. Because it looks like there's this halo of little proteins on the surface of the virus. And those are the proteins that it uses. Remember at the very beginning, it talked about the fact that there are receptors on all our cells and different viruses use different types of receptors that they like. And so these proteins stick to the receptors on the human cell, and they use those receptors to internalize themselves into human cells. And so that's where they get into the cells, they start reproducing themselves, and then they explode, they replicate and they explode. And so how do you catch coronavirus? Well, the way what coronavirus likes more than other viruses is it lives. Different viruses love different organs. There's certain viruses that like kidneys, and others that like the lungs and the brain. Right. Coronavirus is predominantly a virus that loves your entire airway, but those receptors that I was telling you about that it finds, a receptor called ACE2 receptor. It basically, those receptors are on different types of cells in your body. It's a particularly dangerous virus because it finds those receptors that are in your lungs, in your airways, in your blood vessels, in your heart, now we know in your brain. And so multiple different organs have those receptors. And so the virus, once you get infected, it can actually attack all these different parts of your body. And so the way that it spreads is all that virus lives in your airway. And then when a person who's sick sneezes or coughs, the spit that comes out, the snot that comes out, or even when they talk, I'll show you a photo that's going to surprise you. Those drops with the virus land on another person, and then they enter the body of that other person through eyes, nose, and then make the other person sick as well. Or the other way that people get it is if if you're sick and you don't wash your hands and you touch a surface and someone else comes around and touches that area where someone sick has touched, that liquid with the virus that's on the table or whatever surface, if you touch your face with that, then you can transmit it yourself as well. And that's why we always say to wash your hands as well. So this is a very delightful Thursday morning image of a person sneezing, and you can sort of see how far just the liquid that comes out travels. And if that person's infected, imagine the virus that's going to travel. And now we know that this virus actually sticks around for hours, in a room. If it's a very small room and there's been a sick person in there, the virus could stick around for longer. And this is why we always talk about wearing a mask and ensuring that we protect ourselves, because washing our hands and wearing a mask and keeping that distance from others allows us to not get infected if the other person's infected. So how does the virus make you sick? So we talked about the fact that it lands on your nose or mouth or eyes, and then it actually uses those spike molecules, those little proteins that I talked about, to grab onto the cells of your lungs. And then it goes into the cells, and it's carrying all these instructions that basically, I always think of viruses like, they're basically taking your cell and turning it into a zombie machine that creates its own, copies of itself. And so it's carrying these instructions with it. When it enters your cell, it makes the DNA that's in your own body, the machinery that creates, DNA in your own body, uses it, or RNA in your body, uses it to create new copies of itself. It's instructing your cell to do its work for it. And so the state of where we are now, because it's a brand new disease and nobody's had immunity to it, COVID-19, even though it started, in Asia and in November 2020, it's very quickly spread all over the world. Like I said, because of all the reasons that we talk about, we're so connected as a world, and that's only going to increase. And actually, that's a good thing generally, right? We want things to sort of we want that connectivity. There's so many advantages to it, but at the same time, that connectivity also makes us vulnerable to potentially sort of having a virus like this that quickly spreads. We currently have we have about 900,000 total deaths in the world from this disease, and then in the countries, about 188 countries of the world that actually now have seen COVID-19 sort of spread generally within their borders. Let me see if I can do this. I'm going to skip that just for the sake of it. But, again, this video, I will send this link to Ms. Berg so she can share it with you. I find the virus actually very smart in the way that it sort of transmits itself. And this video is very good in showing you all the different organs that it affects. And the gist of it, just for the sake of time, the parts of organs that it affects, is because it affects your blood vessels, for example, because your blood vessels have the same kind of receptor, it can inflame your blood vessels and it can cause blood clots. Because it can get into your brain, it can cause confusion. And we've seen that in a lot of the patients that we see. Because, it causes it attacks your lung, it can cause a pneumonia. It gets into the cells, it inflames your cells, it fills your cells, lung cells up with fluid, and that's what makes it hard for people to breathe. And the other thing, you know, I talked about the fact that in viruses sometimes trick immune systems. The other thing that this virus does in particular is that it revs up your immune system. It makes it go, you want your immune system to react, but sometimes viruses can be tricky in the fact that they can lead your immune system down the wrong path. It make your immune system overreact, like too many alarm bells, right? If you have a fire alarm and instead of everybody getting into a truck, right, in a fire engine and going out to fight the fire, what if like there was just chaos in the firehouse and nobody could get anywhere? The whole city would keep burning, and then the immune system would just be like in total chaos, right? The firehouse might be in complete chaos. And so part of what this virus does is it's super tricky. It actually sometimes in certain people, it leads their immune systems array, causes complete confusion. And so the immune system becomes so revved up that it actually starts attacking your own body. So people who have severe disease, sometimes what we see with COVID-19 is that their own immune system is actually hurting their body as well. This is a great shot of, this is in a microscope. So you would never be able to see this with the naked eye. This is a very powerful electron microscope. And so you can see what the virus looks like. You see these little crowns on its surface, the spike proteins that I talked about. It attaches itself, and these are sort of airways, you know, these are little cilia in your airways. So these are little, you may not know this, but all through your airway, you have these little hair-like protrusions that allow you to keep clearing out dust, you know, so you can, or dirt or pollution that comes in. And here you can see how, like, when the virus gets out of control, it just takes over the whole thing and, you know, and spreads really quickly. So what do we do as doctors and nurses? So my job, you know, I'm a researcher, as Dr. Brennan talked about, but a huge percentage of what I do is I work to make hospitals safer, and I take care of patients with emerging infectious diseases. And so part of my job is to make sure, for example, that healthcare workers put on the right personal protective equipment, and choosing that so that while we're taking care of patients who are sick, we ourselves don't get sick. But then in taking care of the patients, you know, one of the things that we do is we test for the virus itself. We want to make sure that they have this disease, COVID-19, and not something else. We then support the body because, you know, unfortunately, we have a couple of new drugs that I'm going to talk about that help us deal with this virus, but it's because it's a brand new virus. The other tough thing is, you know, a lot of times when these viruses come on the international scene, it takes time to discover drugs that work against a virus. That's why we need clinical trials. And so we have a couple of drugs that we found to be effective, but the scientists and doctors are still in the process of discovering vaccines and drugs that completely help us deal with this disease. And so the body still does a pretty good job of fighting off the disease in most patients, right? As I mentioned, in a large percentage of patients, the disease can be asymptomatic. It means they don't have any symptoms. Then there is a portion of people that get sick enough, you know, that they have symptoms, but they don't need to be hospitalized. But even if they don't need to be hospitalized, what we're discovering is that, you know, in some of those people who got sick, they might have symptoms that last for a really long time, for a couple of months. They just may feel not good because it's taking them that long to sort of clear out the virus, as well as for their immune system to calm down again. And then there are people who actually need to be hospitalized and may even need ICU level care. And in that percentage of people, you know, 5% of everybody sort of who gets infected has symptoms, we know that ends up in the ends up in the ICU. We have about 15% of the people that we diagnose that end up needing hospitalization. And so in children, thankfully, what we know is that children are more likely to have asymptomatic infection, which means they don't have the virus, they don't have the symptoms, but they still carry the virus and they can transmit it to other people. But children can get sick from this as well. A smaller percentage, much smaller percentage of children can actually get symptomatic disease, and some children can get sick enough to actually be in the hospital. But thankfully, it's a much smaller number of people, a much smaller number than what we see in adults. So we support the body as this immune system fights it off, and we do that by, you know, if your kidneys are not working, we give you dialysis. If your lungs are not working, we put you in a machine to help you breathe, just so that you can keep fighting, and you get on the other side of this. We also treat the damage that's caused by the virus itself. You know, a lot of times you'll see people get blood clots, like I mentioned, and so we have to give people therapies that help loosen up their blood, the anticoagulation. We sort of thin their blood so the blood clots go away and they don't cause further damage. We also give them antibiotics. Antibiotics. So what we've discovered is a lot of times people get this infection, and your immune system is like goes haywire, and other viruses and bacteria take advantage of that, and they cause an infection. Like a bacterial pneumonia can happen at the same time as when you have COVID-19. So we give people antibiotics to fight that. And then we have these two drugs that I talked about. Remdesivir, which is a drug that helps reduce the amount of virus. It helps a little bit. And then another drug called steroids. It's a medical steroid that we use in other diseases as well, that helps us calm the immune system down. We try to bring a little bit order in that firehouse of the immune system that's gone crazy, so that the immune system can start attacking the right things rather than your own body. So how do you sort of protect yourself? Avoid close contact for the reasons we talked about, covering your nose when you're sneezing or using a tissue, avoid touching your eyes or nose or mouth, washing your hands whenever you can, and disinfecting surfaces, and staying home when you're sick. But because, so many people can get this disease and sometimes pass it on to others without realizing it, that's why we talk about wearing the mask, because one of the things the masks do is they reduce the amount of virus you're putting out into the environment. And if you wear a mask, what we know is that depending on the type of mask you wear, it also blocks the amount of virus that's coming in, which means you get less of the virus in your body, which might help reduce the severity of the disease that you have. And so the ideal part of this is, if we all kept this distance, and if we stayed home when we're sick, this wouldn't happen. So first scenario here, let's say for every person who's sick, they infect 2 other people, right? So this is the guy in the center on the top, and one in red, he makes 2 people sick. He's in contact with 2 people, and so they get sick. And those 2 people make 2 other people sick. You see the dots here on the bottom, on the top, that are below the woman and the man on the second level. And those 2 people make 2 people sick. And then it keeps going. And that the reason why this pandemic has become so big, the reason so many people have died and people have gotten sick, is because you can see how quickly this can happen. You get the virus. The virus starts, replicating in your body. You start transmitting it to other people without realizing it. And 40% of the new cases that we see are coming from people who don't have symptoms. That means, they spread it without even realizing they have the disease yet. And so what we do, one of the ways that we control this pandemic, aside from telling people to take all the measures that I just talked about, is that we do contact tracing, and we tell people to wear these masks. Because what if this guy, the second day, the bottom, you can see the guy in the red, the second day he goes out, he decides he's going to put on a mask. He doesn't know he's infected. And so he doesn't make that guy sick on the right. And since he doesn't make the guy on the right sick, that guy cannot continue to infect others. And you see what a big difference just that one step made in reducing the number of infections in the community. So that's what, ideally what we want to do is, when we bring down the number of cases, we want to, when people get sick, we want to give them a call and say, hey, who else have you been in contact with while you were sick or while you were infectious? And so once you get infected, once you get exposed to it, there's something called incubation period, which means that the virus is growing in their body, but they haven't quite gotten the disease yet. So that's 2 to 14 days. And then you actually get the illness itself. You're infectious. We think for coronaviruses, you're infectious for a couple of days before you get the symptoms, and then in a few days into your symptoms themselves. And so we ask people who are sick how long they've been around other people in that period of time and who they've been around. And then we reach out to all those other people, and then we say, have you been sick? Let's test you. Let's make sure that you don't have the virus. And then if they're sick, we ask them to stay at home as well. And if they're not sick, we ask them to stay home because, they might get sick during that period of time. And that's how we keep blocking the virus until we get a vaccine for this brand new virus. The best thing for us to do is to take the public health measures as much as we can to reduce the number of people who are getting infected. Because if a lot of people get infected at the same time, this is what happened here in Boston, is that our hospitals got overwhelmed. So I work at Boston Medical Center, and in March and April, 70% of our hospital was filled with COVID-19 patients. And when that happens, healthcare workers like myself and nurses and doctors get overwhelmed. And not only that, but because all the hospital and clinics are busy taking care of COVID patients, we're able to give less attention to all the other diseases that are continuing to happen in the world. So that's sort of the gist of how we sort of block this. And just a thank you for having me, and I'm ready to take any questions that you might have. Thank you.
Dr. Bhadelia, thank you so much for walking us through all of that. I am afraid that we are actually up against the next period, first period class. There's a question or two that have come in from students, but the good news is, as you mentioned, Dr. Alter will be doing sort of a part 2 on this next week, sort of a what next, and talking about vaccines and how they work and how they're developed in that process. So I think we can sort of carry over any questions there, just because I know faculty and students have to sort of quickly move to their next place. But thank you so much for talking with us this morning, for giving us that really robust and thorough explanation. And see if Mr. Brennan has any more. This is a goodbye for us all.
Just to echo your thanks, Mrs. Berg, to Dr. Bhadelia. We have heard so much about this. We've been inundated with information about this since March, as you know. But finally, I think hearing from you, so much is clearer. I think you've not only informed us, but you've allayed some fears, and you've also given us instructions how we can be better citizens in regard to this particular pernicious pandemic. I certainly know that I will be on the lookout for zoonoses today, and I thank you for inspiring me to do so. I hope everybody else has a great day. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Have a good day.